Greetings one and greetings all. Welcome to another edition of the Starry Messenger with Edmund Siderius. Today I'd like to talk to you about Canadian things in general. There's a lot of things have been going on, it seems, in the sphere of Canadian national identity, and I've had time to think about it. And I've just been thinking about it more in general because some of you might know I'm a historian of science, but by and large that means a historian of European things. I mean, in my training, in my background, we started with ancient Mesopotamia, with Egypt, with Greece, and then kind of moved on over the 2,000-year period to focusing on Germany, France, England. But in that narrative, at least as I was educated, Canada, America, really the rest of the world was kind of left out. So there's somewhat of a lacuna in my knowledge there. On top of that, though, some of you might know that I'm kind of a transatlantic person. My mother is from England, and my father is Canadian. And so this gave me, growing up, kind of an interesting kind of in-between feeling when it comes to concepts of national identity and thinking about what Canada is or is not as a country. I mean, I always had somewhat of an accent that was quite noticeable. I grew up in rural Nova Scotia. And one thing about rural Nova Scotia in that space is the concept of the come from away. It's one word. It's not the way it's said. It's clearly one word, but it's just designated to those who were clearly not from that community. Now, I moved to rural Nova Scotia when I was 5, but still, that was enough in many ways. I mean, one of the things, and I don't know if this is characteristic of rural spaces in general or just the east coast of Canada, but oftentimes when I was spending times with my peers and I met one of their parents, or particularly their grandparents, they'd ask me who my grandfather was. And that was very important in that space because it's understandable from their part because they want to kind of get a place for you in terms of what they know about the local knowledge and all of that. But it also implies that, they ought to know who your grandfather is, and that's how that's how you're part of the community. That's how you make sense in some ways within that space. And even though my father's family by and large come from Nova Scotia, it was different enough. It was my grandfather's side of his family largely come from Jador instead of the Annapolis and Gaspereau region. It kind of threw people off when I told them because they didn't really know. But thinking about those sorts of things, having time to reflect on them, I was often found myself caught up in, debates about what it means to be Canadian. Interestingly enough, of course, I mean, more Canadians will know this than, say, American or other viewers. Growing up in the Canadian school system, at least when I did, there was always a very harsh distinction made between Americans and Canadians, and of course the old trope that the only thing that really characterizes what a Canadian is if you mistake them for an American, they will very quickly correct you. And that is certainly true. I know my father in the military was always very quick to tell people that they weren't American soldiers. That was a really important thing for them in terms of even operational issues. But even when we're taught in, say, Canadian history or, say, sociology, there's the divide between, say, nationalism, which is kind of this quiet sense of smug superiority that Canadians have about themselves as a nation, versus American patriotism, which is very loud and flag-wavy and kind of garish. And that's one of the ways that, at least growing up in school, that they specified what is essentially a similar drive, but also distancing what it is that Canadians feel about their own nation from what Americans feel. And on the topic of things we learn from in school in the Canadian system, I'd also like to mention the Heritage Minute videos. I mean, these were largely, I think they're still playing. They were certainly playing throughout the 90s when I was growing up and into the early 2000s. With these series of vignettes. They were just a minute, each a minute long, but they went up, there are at least 60 of them, probably more now. And in part they were a response to the Canadian content laws. I don't know if this is common in other nations, but certainly in Canada there was this anxiety about American media just dominating the scope, the whole, cultural infrastructure. And so that there had to be a certain percentage of all media presented that was of Canadian origin. For instance, this produced that, cultural artifact known as Bob and Doug McKenzie, But it also created space for these heritage minutes. And they each presented, essentially what most Canadians know or think they know about their own history. For those of you who have Canadian friends, I'd suggest if you look up some of these heritage minutes and just quote a section from one of them, most any Canadian who grew up from the 90s will just kind of spontaneously start quoting them back to you. It was a remarkably effective kind of, I'd say, education, possibly brainwashing campaign that went on during that time period. I mean, I still do it. I still feel it kind of in the base of your spine. Someone says, and now the people will know we were here, or various other things. And just Canadians will spontaneously start going into that. It's kind of funny to see it acting both in myself, but also in the people I know, particularly when Canadians are traveling. Quoting a heritage minute will just produce this long conversation, I think, no matter where you are, as long as there's, 2 or 3 Canadians involved. Which is why it's extra funny, because what they present, in many cases, is, a very particular view of what Canadian history is, what the points of interest are, how they should be presented, but also contained within that a review of, what is Canadian kind of excellence, is it derived, these views of multiculturalism, the distinction that, America is a melting pot where everyone kind of gets made the same, whereas Canada is a cultural mosaic. But one of the things that people often forget about that concept of a cultural mosaic was not that it was derived, as I understand it, not just because to emphasize, a kinder, gentler Canada, but to really disenfranchise the French and the native communities, being well, no, it's not just, about, English versus the French or English versus the natives. Canada is this mosaic, and thus everyone has a say. But really that was very disempowering to the French and native communities that had, up until that time existed in Canada. At the same time, I think it is a nice ideal, but its origins are a bit more suspect, I think, than many people realize. And, didn't fully buy into this, but it was certainly on my consciousness as I went through and did my undergraduate. But then I really realized, when I started particularly researching the history of Germany, and then even from Germany looking into classics and, Greco-Roman cultural identities, that this anxiety about identity, what characterizes, people as a nation, is one of the least unique aspects about any kind of group. Particularly the Romans, if you read the Aeneid, for instance, Ovid's Aeneid, he is very clear in that, about this anxiety about the Romans recognizing that they borrowed so much from the Greeks, culturally speaking, that what are they apart from the Greeks? And so much of the Aeneid is actually, I think, Ovid trying to work out what separates Roman virtue from Greek virtue. I mean, you have these interesting scenes where Aeneas, at the start, during the fall of Troy, is trying to figure out how to defeat the Greeks. And one of the things they do is they try to put on Greek armor to be tricky, because one of the Greek virtues was cunning. But that backfires, and it ends up that Aeneas' own forces end up firing arrows and whatnot on him because they mistake him for Greeks, and they're specifying that that's not a Roman virtue. So even in ancient times, a lot of these countries with political bodies had this similar anxiety. Likewise in Germany, I mean, the vast part of the 19th century, it's easy to forget, really, that in some ways Canada as a country is older than Germany, because, I mean, being a North American, Germany has a very clear sense of what it is, or at least from an outside observer, that's what people tend to think, that's the stereotype. But throughout most of the 19th century, there was a deep, deep anxiety about what it meant to be German. And so it's interesting from this, and just all of the power plays in the sense of, shared construction or subversion or, militaristic nationalism that went into that, both with involving anxieties like with the Brothers Grimm and their search for, folk tales and their search for a common language, which was largely done in light of fears about the extinction of German culture after Napoleon conquered much of the German city-states. So that's not new by any stretch of the imagination. This anxiety about what it means to be part of a country, part of a culture. If anything, these reflections have really helped me think that it's not something that's really necessarily productive to antagonize or agonize over, because invariably that anxiety itself is incredibly common. and it's best to just do what you feel is your own excellency and try to attain that. That said, however, there's been a lot of unusual things going on in well, unusual for me because of my own particular views about what Canadian media, the way it presents itself, is, and that's increasingly with this sense of militarism, which we've seen with the Harper government for years now, but it seems to be much more prevalent. And on the topic of militarism, we have figures in Canadian history, or the history of Canadian history, the historiography, such as Jack Granatstein, who wrote a book, a fairly famous / infamous book called Who Killed Canadian History. Now, this was largely spurred on by his belief that Canadians don't know anything really substantially about their history. But looking into it, and not having had a lot of experience myself with Canadian history outside of a high school course, and looking at what Granatstein was actually calling for, I'd have to conclude that really the main thing that killed Canadian history was historians such as Jack Granatstein. I mean, he's a military historian largely, great men, great figures in history, which is, I think, a history of propaganda more than anything else. I mean, that's my main critique, and why I don't know a lot about Canadian history is because I think by and large they tend to be done very, very poorly. Than this kind of chest beating, we're the best, but it's Canadian, so it's kind of this quiet, smug, we're the best. Americans think they're the best, but really, we know we're the best. Which is really just a bad conscience, I think. And so, yeah, one of the things that was very common from what I understand about Jack Granatstein's courses, it was very much like great man dates, the very driest, blandest, most clearly propagandistic ways of presenting history possible. And of course, if that's the way you're presenting what history means, not many people are going to be interested in it. I mean, my own personal contention, however, is that the best histories are fundamentally subversive histories. I mean, where is the Howard Zinn, for instance, of Canadian history? Maybe I just don't know who to look for, but I've not seen it as of yet. So it's no wonder, though, that a lot of people feel disillusioned about Canadian history, like what happened in Canada, what its particularly points of intrigue are. Despite the fact that there are, at least from what I know, even with my limited knowledge, a number of interesting things about Canadian history in terms of in the 19th century, the spiritualist movement, the prosecution of spiritualists in Toronto even. Figures like, although in the East Coast, very interesting stories like figures like the Lunar Rogue, which really isn't mentioned. He was an escape artist and as far as I can tell, a kleptomaniac who just kept on stealing things around the East Coast, a compulsive liar, but who could never really be kept for any long period of time. The only time they did capture him, he pretended to be quite insane. They asked who he was, where he was from, and he just cackled and pointed to the moon. And eventually, he got sympathizers, and he started to create all of these mannequins in his cell that could actually move, and he was calling them his family. And eventually he got out. They let him off because he seemed to be too insane, and then just disappeared again. And there's a lot of weird, eccentric, interesting, both from individual narrative point of view, but also from a cultural space within Canadian history, such as the Lunar Rogue, such as what happened to spiritualists in Winnipeg. Winnipeg actually has a very interesting a psychical research library that was considered so valuable that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, when he was doing his trips around North America, made a special trip to Winnipeg just to check out the library. I forget the name of the doctor who established it off the top of my head, but there's a lot of curious things there that just haven't really been well explored. I mean, and maybe they won't be until people other than Canadians start doing Canadian history. I'm not entirely sure. But touching back on this militarization, since the Canadian history is Canadian military history, or history of great men, of power players in the world stage, which I think Granatstein kind of represents this kind of very arid view of what history is, and in particular, and what Canadian history is. There's been a lot of people recently who've been trying to talk about a tougher, rougher sense of Canadian national identity. And it really struck home for me when I saw the changes that were made to the $50 and $20 bills. I mean, it seems like it's a little thing, but particularly for those of you who aren't from Canada, But on the $20 bill, they used to have this very delightful image of Haida artwork and totem poles. And they changed that to the Vimy Ridge Memorial, which in and of itself is, it's true it's part of Canadian history, but it's a very militarized part of Canadian history. And particularly to remove one of the few places where Native identity was at least, I'm not saying it necessarily did a lot, but still present in the Canadian cultural imagination on their bills, is saying something. Likewise with the $50 bill, which used to have actually a Declaration of the Rights of Women on it, has now been removed and replaced with the research icebreaker image. And of course, I think the subtext of that is really the Arctic sovereignty issue that's been going on between Canada and Russia recently, with Harper saber rattling and having warships and vessels going through the Arctic just to make sure that the Russians know that it's really Canadian land or territory. Anyway. And you're just starting to see this a lot more, which is kind of disconcerting. And if anything, I think that both the work that figures like Jack Grandenstein does, as well as this movement towards Canadian militarism does, is really damage the sense of actually what is, vital and culturally, I think, significant about any nation. Is that not that sense of anxiety and about that, that insecurity which really makes Canadians, Americans, Germans, Greeks, anyone feel like they need to assert themselves violently, rather than actually just kind of finding the resources within themselves and making something more from that. The cultural richness, I think, is somewhat inimical to this kind of militarization. But yeah, this has been a bit of a rambling talk, but I've been trying to not to punctuate my sentences with as much, and I thought it's been a while since I've done a video blog. I hope at least some of the meditations have been interesting, at least culturally informative for those of you not from Canada, or from Canada as well. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks again for visiting the Starry Messenger.